So we're going to start in Berlin, where Rob has been speed dating. Well, not really, but what have you been up to, Rob, in Berlin? Tell us about it.
Well, I was in Berlin for TransferRoom, which is essentially a transfer marketplace. 300 clubs from all across the world, another 80 agencies, basically all in the same room in Berlin, talking about transfers. As you said in the intro, it's that time of year where clubs are starting to kind of lay the groundwork for what they may do in the summer. So it's a really kind of important period for recruitment teams all across the world to kind of get their ducks in a row before the deals start happening in the summer window.
So you spent 2 days in Berlin. Rob, what did you see? Who did you see? And what do we know?
Well, I mean, it's quite an interesting idea, really. Essentially, it's, as I said before, it's a marketplace. It's getting clubs from all over the world in the same room as agencies from all over the world, and all they're doing is talking about transfers. I mean, the actual setup of the room is quite interesting. You mentioned there that it's like speed dating. That's essentially exactly what it is. You sign up for an app. You can approach different clubs and different agencies for meetings. Those meetings last about 15 minutes. You sit in a big room. There's a huge clock above your head counting down from 15 minutes to zero. That when it gets to 1 minute to go, there's a big bell that rings 3 times. That means that you get up and you shake hands and you go your separate ways and on to the next meeting, on to the next transfer. So it's quite an interesting idea, and essentially it's just about sharing information. I mentioned there that it's the time of year where clubs are really starting to get their recruitment operations into gear ahead of the summer window. And clubs are really just trying to get in front of other clubs, in front of other agents to understand which players may be available, which areas of squads different clubs are looking to strengthen. Agencies are looking, where can they place their players? Can they place them permanently somewhere? Maybe they have to move on loan. So deals aren't necessarily being done across these tables. They're not shaking hands and players are moving then and there. But essentially, it's gathering information, getting that data together so they can start doing deals in the summer window once it opens.
I mean, your piece is online on ESPN.com, and it's a fascinating piece. And I think it's something that people should read to kind of educate themselves on the transfer market. I mean, I'm reading it thinking, well, I know a lot of fans are going to look at this and say, well, if you work at a club like Liverpool, Man United, Man City, Arsenal, whoever, you don't need to go to a place like this because you know whoever you need to speak to. But the reality is that there are so many clubs in the world now that you can't possibly know everybody at every club. And I think one example you made was the Victor Gyökeres transfer 2 years ago from Coventry to Sporting Lisbon. Now, big deal. And obviously Gyökeres could become a big deal again this summer. But the reality is that deal basically began at one of these transfer room meetings because Sporting Lisbon and Coventry City had never had any connection before.
Exactly. And that's exactly what it is. And you take a deal, say, De Ligt from Bayern to Man United in the summer. Bayern and Man United have done deals in the past. Their top representatives know each other anyway. They've seen each other. They've played each other in the Champions League. You have these UEFA dinners. You have those contacts. If Man United need to sign a player from Bayern, they've got the right number. And essentially, TransferRoom started because the people behind it realised that a lot of clubs, a lot of sporting directors of football didn't have the right numbers at clubs. And the Gyökeres one is a good example because Sporting Lisbon hadn't dealt with Coventry in the past, but they had a need for a centre forward of Gyökeres' profile. They knew that Coventry were open to listening to offers for Gyökeres because of the meetings that happened at TransferRoom, and were able to kind of start a dialogue in those meetings that ended up with Gyökeres moving to Sporting Lisbon. And as you've said there's a chance that he's going to be one of the big money signings in this window. And that Sporting and Coventry relationship is only one example. And there's hundreds of these examples across the world. Clubs that just would never have dealings with each other, but it's important for them to understand which players are available. Can they fill a need that they have? You mentioned there about the big Premier League clubs. Yeah, and the big Premier League clubs are not necessarily doing the bulk of their massive business in these meetings, but one of the things that the Premier League clubs do use it for, the big top 6 Premier League clubs, is to try and place their younger players. Traditionally, 25 years ago, Man United would place their younger players at clubs around the Northwest, Stockport, Rochdale, Bury, Crewe, Alexandra, but there's a much bigger world out there. So you end up with deals, like Zidane Iqbal, for example, when he was at Man United, kind of broke into the first team, but ended up moving permanently to Holland. Now, again, that's a relationship that wouldn't necessarily have existed if it hadn't been for these transfer room forums.
I must admit, I'm reading it, and it kind of, the image that came to mind was like a football version of a car boot sale. Now, for people that kind of don't understand a car boot sale, if you're outside the UK, it's when you basically turn up on a Sunday morning, you open your car up, you boot your trunk, you've got a lot of things that unloved or used to love items that you don't need anymore, stuff that's not very good, lavish purchases that you kind of regret, that you want to get rid of. And it's basically anyone can turn up and say, oh, I fancy that bit of junk in your car, or I fancy that, something that could be quite useful. And that's basically what it sounds like. You've got 10, 15 minutes to decide if you want to buy somebody else's rubbish or somebody else's junk, which might be very good for you. But that's just my perception of it. But I think one thing that struck me was interesting, Rob. You said that 17 Premier League clubs were represented. Do we know? Are you able to tell us who the 3 Premier League clubs that weren't there, who they are?
Probably
why
not able to, only because there were 17 Premier League clubs there officially. There were another 3 who sent representatives who weren't necessarily part of the actual forum, but had sent representatives, because ultimately this transfer room is growing so much that clubs now cannot afford not to be part of it. And when I spoke to Simon Ankerson in Berlin, he said that this had started, and the first forum that they had was in 2018, and they had 50 clubs, which obviously isn't a lot when you talk about the amount of clubs that there are throughout the world. But what's happened is it's grown so much that clubs have decided that you just cannot afford not to be there. Now, different clubs sent different people within their organisation. It wasn't just sporting directors. It wasn't just directors of football. Some sent chief scouts, some sent data analysts, some sent like other people lower down within their scouting department. But what they've found is that clubs can't pass up the opportunity to be in these meetings, in this room, because there's so much information that's being exchanged between clubs. It's developing relationships between clubs that wouldn't necessarily have them. That if you are missing out, and there were 3 Premier League clubs who weren't officially represented there, although they did have people there to kind of look and see how it was working. The 3 Premier League clubs who weren't officially represented were looking at it and thinking, well, we can't not be a part of this. And there are big clubs who aren't on the forum. I think Real Madrid are one of them, because they tend to do their business in a different way. They trust their own scouting network. They trust their own database to have every single thing that they need to make these really informed choices. Well, really, out of all the big clubs in the world, Real Madrid are in the minority of that, because everyone else, whether it be Man City, Man United, Bayer Leverkusen, Bayern Munich, Barcelona, are all participating in these meetings in some way, whether it's to get a massive deal over the line, or whether it's just to send one of their younger kids to a place where they wouldn't necessarily send them. These clubs have decided that they have to be part of this, because ultimately it's the way that the transfer market is going.
Yeah, I think from reading the piece, it strikes me as that you're not going to get a big box office transfer out of this. It's not where Man United, Liverpool, Arsenal, Real Madrid go to do a big deal. It's where those clubs, for instance, like you say, might be looking to offload some of their unwanted players, the players that are yet in the contract they can't find a buy for, or the young kids. That's the value for the bigger clubs. For the smaller clubs, or the clubs that have got data, it's more about them picking up bargains or trying to instigate moves or finding out what the big clubs are letting go, so they've got an idea in the summer what they can go for. So it's not really a case of, I'm not going to ask you what are the big deals you've heard about, because it's not really that idea, is it? It's more a case of beneath the top 5%, that's where the deals that we look at that catch our eyes. Beneath that, it's the deals that you don't often notice that are going to get done at TransferRoom.
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of conversations that were happening. Not necessarily the massive deals, but Man City are still in the same room as Bayer Leverkusen, and obviously they've been heavily linked with Florian Wirtz. I mean, while they're not kind of thrashing out the intricacies of that deal, there are conversations that are happening around a multitude of players. One of the players who was being talked about an awful lot was Liam Delap at Ipswich. Again, other clubs' representatives were trying to find out what was going to happen with Liam Delap. Does he want to stay in the Premier League, for example? Is he open to moving abroad? Is it a foregone conclusion that if Ipswich get relegated from the Premier League that he'll have to leave? What are Ipswich thinking about that? Do they think that there's half a chance that he might stay? Now, these are all just very, very... I mean, these are things that I know that people may be listening thinking, well, that's a news story, that's a news story, that's a news... And it probably is, but these are conversations that are happening all the time with any number of different players, because ultimately clubs can only act when they have that information. There's no point I don't know, Bayern Munich, for example, put in a massive bid in for Liam Delap, if they already know that Liam Delap has decided that he wants to stay in the Premier League or he wants to stay at Ipswich, Bayern just aren't going to do that. So what happens is that Bayern need to go and find out what his plans are, whether that's talking to his agent. And, again, there weren't just clubs at this meeting. There was 83 agencies, I think. So you can go and speak to the agent about what his plans are. You can go and speak to Ipswich about, what their plans are for him. Are they going to have to let him go? Are they going to have to, do they want to keep him? And it all just adds to the kind of the bigger picture, the data that they have on these players, that when it comes to making offers and it comes to trying to sign players, that they can make a more informed choice. And the same goes for agencies. Agencies are there. There was one agency I spoke to, SEG, who look after Rasmus Højlund and Erik ten Hag, who went into these meetings with a list of around sort of between 80 and 100 players who they felt was half a chance that they could move in the summer. And again, it's about going to clubs and seeing if they can find a fit for that player. Is that club looking for a player of the same profile? Do they have the budget to pay for that transfer fee? Do they have the wage structure to pay the wages for that player? It's all just about exchanging information. And so when you get to the end of April, May, possibly the start of June, that you're in a really, really strong position to make these deals actually happen.
I know I looked at one of the quote from Brandon Lever at SCG, and he said that 99% of these chats don't really lead to a deal being done, but I suppose that 1% do, and the other 99% is a contact made, isn't it? And I suppose if you don't go, you don't know, and that's the value of being there, that you might not get a transfer out of it, but you've got a contact that you can refer back to in 6 months' time, a year's time, whatever, and somebody that works at a club or an agency that you can actually tap into in future.
Exactly. I mean, and he was really good actually explaining kind of what happens in these meetings. And a term he used more than once was planting seeds. Now, he's from an agency, so he's booking meetings with clubs across the world. He spoke to a load of Swiss clubs. He spoke to a load of German clubs. He also spoke to a load of English clubs. He's got a list of players that he thinks, or SEG think, could possibly move in the summer. Now, before these meetings, it's his job to kind of work on these lists and pitch players to the right clubs. There's no point him having a player who's going to cost £10 million and pitching him to a Serbian club who just don't pay £10 million transfer fees. That's completely pointless. So it's about matching what a club needs with the players that he or SEG have available. And you're right, he does say there that there are 99% of these meetings come to nothing, but there are these little seeds that start a transfer room that grow into something. And one of the examples he used was Mark Flecken at Brentford. Again, an SEG player at TransferRoom Forum a couple of years ago. He was, SEG representatives were talking to different clubs. You end up speaking to Brentford. Brentford say, actually, we're looking for a goalkeeper. SEG say, well, actually, we've got a couple here. What kind of thing are you looking for? You're looking for, someone who's great with his feet. Are you looking for more of a shot stopper? Looking for someone who's, a really tall keeper who's going to come in for crosses? All these kind of things. Brentford say exactly what they're after, and they say, well, actually, we've got this guy, Flecken, who we think will be perfect. So Brentford then go away and check their own databases. They send scouts to watch him and watch videos. And from that tiny little seed that happens in a meeting, it goes on and on and on and moves forward to the point where Mark Flecken signs for Brentford and becomes one of the best goalkeepers in the Premier League. And that's the kind of thing that can happen at these transfer room forums that perhaps wouldn't have happened if SCG and Brentford weren't in the same room together.
I don't want to put you on the spot now, but I'm going to put you on the spot in terms of any deals that you can tee up for the summer. Any leagues that we should be looking at? I know the Swiss League gets mentioned. Any particular leagues or players that we should be looking for that might generate a transfer out of this meeting?
Well, I've mentioned that. I think that Liam Delap is obviously one to keep an eye out. We've done sections on this pod before where I think you in the past have spoken about how tough it is to find strikers. Real, well-established goal-scoring number nines. It's quite a dying art, to be honest. And Liam Delap has done so well in the Premier League in a team that ultimately has struggled and is probably going to get relegated, that there are going to be an awful lot of clubs looking at him, whether it's a return to Man City, whether it's Chelsea, whether it's Man United, whether there are clubs abroad who will look at him. I think that's certainly one to keep an eye on. Other than that, again, Florian Wirtz would be another one that I would say it looks relatively likely to leave in the summer. He's done probably everything he can do at Bayer Leverkusen. There's an awful lot of interest. Man City is one. Bayern Munich is another that's been interested. Real Madrid, another that's been linked simply because of Wirtz's profile within world football. There isn't an awful lot. One of the trends that they did a kind of a PowerPoint before the actual meeting started about kind of trends that they'd noticed within the transfer market, and there is kind of a reduction in some of the transfer spending that they're seeing with major clubs, because ultimately the financial restrictions are tightening and clubs have to kind of look after their budgets a lot more than perhaps they did sort of 5-10 years ago. That said, there are going to be big deals that happen in the summer simply because there aren't a lot of players that fit the profile or fit the bill for these massive clubs. So when you've got a player like Liam Delap, who has done really well for Ipswich in the Premier League, is now a kind of proven Premier League goal scorer. Because there aren't many players like that around, there is going to be an awful lot of interest, both from the Premier League and from abroad. And it wouldn't be a massive surprise to me if he has a really big transfer in the summer.
I did notice that the next one is in Buenos Aires, which that's kind of intriguing considering the talent that comes out of South America, particularly Argentina. Now, I'm not going to suggest we're looking for the next Lionel Messi, but we do know that Argentina is probably, I'm just kind of going off the cuff here, but that country seems to produce more players overseas than any other country in the world. So I imagine a lot of people are quite excited about going to Buenos Aires, probably you as well, quite excited about it, to see what happens there. That meeting.
Well, yeah, and that is one of the things that came out of me going to Berlin, is that it wasn't necessarily about the players who were kind of on the market right now, that lots of the Premier League clubs, two of the big six Premier League clubs I've spoken to said that they went there because there were areas of the world that they thought were not untapped is the wrong word, because obviously everyone knows that Brazil and Argentina produce really great players, but they didn't have the contacts and the coverage of those areas that perhaps they could. And there was one top six scout who I spoke to said that primarily the reason that he travelled to Berlin was because he wanted to meet with two Brazilian agents, because that was a line of communication that wasn't necessarily open. They wanted to use these agents to go into South America and scout essentially the next Messi, and that's obviously a stretch, but that's exactly what they were trying to do. And because there was we just mentioned there that with Delap, there are so few sort of top players that these clubs are going for, and the competition for these players is so great that there is a reason to go into South America and improve your scouting there, improve your contacts, because if you can get a 17-year-old player for €5 million, that's obviously far better than having to wait until he's 24 and paying €100 million. So there were a lot of Premier League Big Six clubs who were going to Berlin to try and meet these different agencies, particularly South American agencies, to try and get a foothold, and more of a foothold in the region. So when there is a fantastic young player coming from Argentina or Brazil, that they were first in the queue because they already have those contacts. They can ring someone up who they know they've met in Berlin anyway. They can ring them up and say, look, can you go and A, look at this player, B, speak to his family, C, find out who his agent is, D, find out all the financials around it, and then come back to us and report back. And when you have all that information, you're in a far better position to make these signings, I suppose, unearth these diamonds. Because if you can do that as a Premier League club, that's half the battle won. Then you're not having to spend millions and millions of pounds on transfer fees because you've already got the player in your training ground already.
Well, the La Liga title race has been dominated by players from South America. Some of the best players, we're talking Rafinha, Vinny Jr., Julian Alvarez. So after the break, we're going to talk about the La Liga title race and how close it's been this season.
Well, the title races in England, Germany and France look like they're already over, but there are exciting title races in Italy and Spain. We're joined now by our two guys in Spain, Sam and Alex. Alex, I'm going to start with you first because you're in Madrid. All of these three teams, Real Madrid, Barcelona and Atletico Madrid, have had wobbles. Atletico Madrid are having their little wobble right now, it would seem. Where are we at with this title race with these three teams, and how do you see it panning out?
Yeah, well, where we're at is 10 games to go. 10 games to go, and it's very much up for grabs. You're right, Atleti have had this little wobble. They lost that incredible game 4-2 to Barcelona before the break when they were 2-0 up. Before that, they lost to Getafe. But all three teams, as you say, have had their moments over the course of the season. The most dramatic kind of drop-off was probably Barcelona's back in November, December, when they went on a really kind of historically bad run, which is almost inexplicable because both before that and after that, they've been really good, the best team in Spain. Real Madrid have been a little bit more up and down. They haven't sort of had one sustained wobble, as you put it, but they've kind of had their just games they've dropped points in they shouldn't have against what you'd think of as lesser teams. Atletico Madrid at one point looked like the most sort of reliable candidate, but that's maybe not the case now. But to be honest, where are we? Look, we don't know. It's still open. Yes, Barca are in the driver's seat because they're top and they've got this game in hand that they're gonna play on Thursday as well. But there's not much in it. And like I say, with 10 games to go, any one of these three teams could still win the league.
Sam, obviously the game on Thursday. I think it's Thursday they play the Barca's game in hand. That is the big one, isn't it? If they win that and take that 3-point lead, that puts them in pole position. But I guess there's a bit of pressure on them to actually do it now, isn't it, to make sure that they get that win?
Yeah, this Thursday game's so huge, not just because, like you say, it's the game in hand, but because of the whole circumstances around this game being played. It was obviously called off at the start of March because the Barca first team doctor died in the hours before the game, so the game was rightly postponed, and now they've sort of shoehorned it into this Thursday on the back end of the international break. In all probability, Barca are going to have to play the game without Rafinha. He's playing sort of, Tuesday night South American time, Wednesday morning Spain time, so it's unlikely he's going to be back for that game on Thursday. There's been some sort of reports about him going on the bench, but pretty stupid with the flight back. So it takes on sort of an extra sentiment. If Barca then lose that game, you've obviously got all the controversy of, should it have been played, should they play it without Rafinha, etc. and whatnot. If they win it, they're 7 points clear of Atletico. And I know Rob and Alex have touched on the fact that there have been some big turnarounds at the top of the table this season. Barca obviously chucking away a big lead. Real Madrid a decent lead at the end of January. But you would imagine with the games that are to go, 7 points, I can't see Barca dropping 7 more points given their form in 2025 than Atletico. So you're looking at it being really, really tough for Atletico if Barca win that game against Osasuna on Thursday. But yeah, it's just so huge because it's that game in hand. It gives them the advantage on Real Madrid. 3 points, which is possibly 4 points because they won 4-0 at the Bernabeu. So they could even sort of lose 3-0 to Real Madrid if they beat Osasuna and then match their other results, and they'd still sort of finish ahead of them on head-to-head.
Sam, just on that, obviously we've heard Carlo Ancelotti complaining about playing so many games in 72 hours recently. Now I'm looking at the fixtures. Barca are due to play Sunday afternoon against Girona after playing on Thursday night. So first of all, they're playing in less than 72 hours between games. But also, have they not complained about having to play on a Thursday, which is basically still international break? Because like you say, a lot of players are less than 24 hours after playing in South America. So how is this happening? How are they playing such a big game, basically tagged onto the end of international break?
Yeah, so like I said, it was called off originally, and the slots to fit it back in, there aren't many spaces available. Barca are still in the Copa del Rey, they're still in the Champions League, which means there's just one spot, which is at the end of the season between the 37th and the 38th game, which is when Barca and Osasuna both said they were happy to play the game. The Federation, sort of a committee that the Federation have ruled that the game should be played on the Thursday. Barca and Osasuna both appealed that, and appeals committee, a judge at the appeals committee, if you will, ruled that no, this game has to be played on Thursday because more damaging to the sort of integrity of the competition would be having it played so late in the season when perhaps there's more on the line than playing it on a Thursday at the end of the international break when Barca are potentially without players, which sounds crazy when you say it out loud. I think there is precedent. Real Madrid played in between those final two fixtures at the end of the season against Celta Vigo a couple of years back. But they were ruled against, and they have to play this game. And yeah, like you say, if they then do drop points with, players coming back late from internationals, players not available, it won't be the last we hear of it, I'm sure.
Alex, can I just add, Sam's just touched on it there about the competitions that the clubs are still involved in. Obviously, we saw Atletico go out of the Champions League in quite heartbreaking circumstances for them. Barca and Real Madrid are still in. Do you see that playing a part in this title race? I mean, in England, we would often look at it and say, well, the teams left in the Champions League might be distracted by the massive Champions League fixtures. Is that something that's being talked about in Spain? And do you think it's going to be a bit of a distraction for those two teams who are left in the competition?
I think you can look at it two ways. I mean, you can kind of frame it as a distraction, maybe, or you can look at it as a way of kind of maintaining momentum. Sometimes a team goes on a run, they've got that momentum with them in multiple competitions, winning games, and it kind of helps. It helps sort of keep them going, doesn't it? And Atletico, for example, as you say, out of the Champions League, we've got the Copa del Rey semi-final second legs next week, which is Real Madrid, Real Sociedad, Atletico, Barca. So Atleti potentially, let's say, for argument's sake, Atleti go out of the Cup. They've gone out of the Champions League. Yes, you can look at it and say, okay, that leads them to focus on the league, but it also might start to feel like they're sort of losing it and slipping away because, they're out of two competitions. They've only got one left. I think all of these three teams really have got the squads to cope with multiple competitions. Atletico's squad is very, very strong. So I think it depends how you look at it. I think you can sort of make the case both ways. I don't think it has to be a distraction. I think you can actually look at it as something positive as well.
Just on Atletico, are they still in? I mean, listen, obviously they're still in it, but are they still in it to the point where you actually think they're still in it? Or are you thinking if they're not careful, Athletic Club could catch them and take third?
I think that might be a step too far. I mean, look, you can't rule it out because, like I say, out of the Champions League, if they go out of the Cup, what a bad result or two in the league, and suddenly it's like sort of the season's over. They let it go, and all of a sudden, they've got Athletic maybe breathing down their necks. But I think I can't see that. I'd be amazed if that happened. I think it is this top three is going to be at the top three at the end of the season. Are Atleti, outsiders right now, and you'd put it between Barca and Madrid to win it? Yeah, probably. I think so. But I think it would take looking at the fixture list, certainly Atletico's fixture list, their remaining games, they'll be the favourites in most, if not all, of their remaining games in the league. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to go and get 3 points in every game. Of course it doesn't. We've seen that through the course of this season. None of these 3 teams have done that. But you'd expect them to get enough points to finish at least third.
Sam, I know we mentioned earlier that there is a Clásico left, isn't there, in May? There is still a possibility of a Barcelona-Real Madrid Champions League final. I mean, it could be a kind of a rivalry and a season for the ages if all those things come together, particularly if the Clásico comes down to, or the title race comes down to the result of that Clásico in May.
Yeah, and not just that as well. We could be looking at a Clásico Copa del Rey final as well. We've obviously got the semi-finals next week. Barca and Atletico 4 or Real Madrid with a lead against Real Sociedad playing at home. You'd expect them to be there, and then it's a case of you could be looking at a Clásico at the end of April in the Copa del Rey final, the La Liga Clásico, and maybe we're jumping a little bit too far ahead. But like you say, with the way the draw is in the Champions League, it's not out of the question that those teams both reach that stage. It would be fascinating. It's sort of there's not the same sort of animosity that there was. If you think back to those famous 4 Clásicos that were fueled by sort of Mourinho and Guardiola, it's not quite there at the moment. But having 3 such huge games so close together would sort of test this sort of. I guess it's kind of obviously not a newer rivalry in terms of these clubs, but in terms of these players, this Madrid side with Mbappe, I guess there is a little bit there with a little bit of sort of rivalry there with Vinicius already, but then this young Barca side sort of looking to establish themselves. They've already beaten Madrid twice this season. It would be huge. And it's obviously the huge game when you look at those fixtures that are left, and one which Atletico will probably have an eye on as well, thinking if we can win all our games and get to there and then sort of see how that can feed into the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks of the season and give them half a chance. An Athletic Club as well could have a say, even if they can't catch Atletico Madrid. They do play Real Madrid, who they beat earlier in the season. They do play Barcelona on the last game of the season. They're also trying to get to the Europa League final, which is at San Mamés, which is huge for them. So even if they can't catch Atletico Madrid, they're one of those sides that could have a big say because they play against Madrid and Barca, and they're one of those sides that are capable of beating them.
Just a question for both of you. I'll ask Alex first, but there's so many superstar players in the league. Right now, which player do you think is the one most likely to decide this title race? Is it Lamine Yamal? Is it Lewandowski? Is it Rafinha? Is it Vinny Jr.? Is it Mbappe? Is it Bellingham? Do you know what I mean? There's so many superstars there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say Rafinha's been the player of the season so far, ahead of the likes of Lamine Yamal, ahead of the likes of Pedri, who's been superb for Barca in midfield. So I think you'd probably go with Rafinha in terms of, but then also that Barca team, it does feel like a proper collective. It does feel like what Flick has built there is very much a team. And of course, the accusation, it's easy to level at this Real Madrid team, but there is some truth in it, is that they are more of a collection of individuals and less than a unit. In terms of one Real Madrid player, I think it is Mbappe. I think if he scores goals consistently, they're in with a chance. If he doesn't, it's more difficult. But no, for me, the player of the season so far is Rafinha. If he continues to be decisive when he's back from the international break, not in time, of course, for Thursday's game, then it might be him.
Yeah, if you look at Barcelona's season, it's hard to argue that Rafinha's been their best player of the season. I certainly wouldn't argue against that. The goals he scored against Real Madrid in Clásicos, a hat-trick against Bayern Munich. In all the big games he's been there, I'd probably say he's probably closely followed in terms of Barca's best players of the season by Pedri. But going into this final stretch, and I've sort of said this all season as well, the player I look to, or you look to when Barca need a result is Lamine Yamal. He scored, deflected, but that late winner against Atletico Madrid. He has the great goal against Benfica in the Champions League. We saw earlier this week in the Nations League, he scored a good goal against Netherlands for Spain in extra time. He's the one player sort of when the chips are down, he's the one that can provide a spark against, a team that's sitting deep or whatnot. And he kind of thrives under this pressure. And I think in a title race and in the big games, I'd probably be looking to him as much, if not more than Rafinha.
So, Can I just ask one on Barcelona? I mean, I know that they are one of the biggest clubs in the world, but is there any kind of surprise that they've got themselves in this position, to possibly win La Liga, to win the Champions League, given that, we read a lot and see a lot about their financial struggles, that they're up against a Real Madrid team who were able to add arguably the best player in the world in the summer in Kylian Mbappe, but they've had 2 massive wins over Real Madrid already this season. They're in a fantastic position in the league, also still in the Champions League. Has there been any kind of surprise, whether small or big, that they're in this position?
Yeah, it's absolute surprise at how well Hansi Flick has done. I think there was kind of, by the end, there was an acknowledgement that Xavi had perhaps ran his course, not necessarily as a coach, but just the way the environment and the sort of noise that comes out around the club made his position not quite untenable, but it was coming that way, and it sort of made sense to make that change. Otherwise, you're probably looking at, October, you've got sort of, like Manchester United had with Erik ten Hag, that sort of situation where you're having to make a break mid-season. So it was the right call to replace him. There were certainly doubts around Flick. He hadn't done a great job with Germany. His top level experience in club football obviously was great with that Bayern Munich team, but that was an 18-month spell that he had them playing really well. He'd done a lot of his career as an assistant coach. So yeah, they're surprised at how quickly he's managed to get his team up and running. I think pretty much every player in the Barcelona team has improved this season. They've stayed fitter when you look at Pedri not getting injured, etc., and the lack of sort of muscle injuries. The level that Rafinha has reached this season compared to his first 2 seasons. I think with other players like Pau Kubasi, Lamine Yamal, there was sort of an expectation that they would continue to improve. But yeah, it's absolutely surprised that going into final 6 weeks of the season, Barca have won the Super Cup, and they're in a position to win all 3 trophies. And now they would expect to win a trophy. I think at the start of the season, it wasn't so much. And, the players and people at the club would never say we didn't want to win a trophy, but what they were looking for was, an evolution, which they've had and they've seen. And now obviously the goals have changed. And now the expectation is that this team sort of, verifies and what they've done this season and goes on and wins something.
Just before we ask you both a prediction, which is obviously the worst question to ask anybody, you mentioned Athletic Club before the Europa League. Now, obviously, there's a big Premier League involvement in the Europa League. Man United and Tottenham are still in it. I think they're both the favourites to win it. Classic, parochial, English bookmakers saying the English teams are favourites to win it. Athletic Club play Rangers next. Just what sort of threat are they in the Europa League? And should we be seeing them as the favourites, considering obviously they play the final in Bilbao?
Yeah, they're a great team, aren't they? They're a great team. They're very, very... Look, talk about the impact that Flick's had at Barca. What Ernesto Valverde's done at Athletic, not for the first time there, is remarkable. And I would put them I don't know if they're the favourites to win it, but I don't know how much impact having the final at home has. But I'd say they're extremely, extremely strong contenders, because if you don't watch them in the Liga every week, they're a top team, really well organised, very talented players. Everyone knows about the Williams brothers, but there are other players there as well. And yeah, I think they're right there.
Yeah, this has been their motivation from the start of the season. Like Alex says, it's hard for us to perhaps gauge how much, having that home final does sort of give you that extra 1-2% or whatever when it comes to, these quarterfinals, semi-finals that they've got coming up now. But last summer when Barcelona wanted to sign Nico Williams, one of the big arguments that sort of Iñaki and the Athletic teammates said to Nico was like, look, stay, give us one more year. Let's get to the final. Let's win this Europa League at San Mamés. It'd be a historic achievement for the club. You just seen the celebrations they had last year after winning the Copa del Rey. That's what they want to do this year now, go and win the Europa League at San Mamés. It's been something that they've been talking about since last summer, since they qualified for the Europa League, and knowing that the final was going to take place there. I think that does make them, for me, the most dangerous team left in the competition, without, like you say, calling out the English teams. Lazio have done really well as well in the competition so far.
So you're both backing Bilbao to win that, obviously. Sorry, Athletic Club. All right, La Liga. Is it going to be Barca, Real, or is it going to be Atleti? I'll ask you first, Alex. You've got 2 teams in the game, just about.
Well, at the start of the season, I said Real Madrid. It was a very basic prediction. They were champions, and they brought in Mbappe. But I think Barcelona now. I think that of course, the game in hand. Let's see what happens with that. But they're pretty clearly the best all-round team. They had, as we discussed, that one big drop off, but they've been consistently excellent since, and they were before as well. I think Barcelona, they're more reliable, I think, than Madrid right now.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards Barcelona because they potentially got that advantage if they win the game in hand. And as I mentioned before, they've also got that head-to-head against Real Madrid where they can afford to sort of, finish level on points with Madrid as long as they don't get beat more than 4-0 by them and still win the league. So not only do they have a potential 3-point advantage, they also have the advantage if they finish level. I think all teams will drop points between now and the end of the season. There's going to be tricky spells between sort of, Copa del Rey games and Champions League games for all clubs. But yeah, I think Barca somewhere around sort of 55%, maybe Madrid at around 40% and 5% to Atletico.
And if it does come down to the Clásico, I mean, look what happened. As we mentioned in the Clásico so far this season, Barca won 4-0 and 5-2. I mean, so there'd be heavy favourites in that game if it does come down to that.
I've got a funny feeling we're getting this band together at the end of May for the Champions League final. But in the meantime, we'll leave you guys to it. Thanks again, guys. Okay, so to finish this week, you've saved me the best till last. We've got Nedum Onuoha, the former Man City, Sunderland, QPR and Real Salt Lake defender, who's our new columnist on ESPN FC. Obviously, you've seen Nedum before as a pundit on the show, but he's joining us this week to talk about his new column, which is about player criticism, about when players are criticised by fans, by media, by ex-players. So, Nedum, talk me through the column.
Okay. So the column itself is one which came in recent weeks with the likes of Bruno Fernandes, for example, being asked to comment on what, say, Roy Keane has been saying about him, and not just in one particular week. We're talking about longer periods of time. But that also then extends out to, say, the likes of, say, a Harry Maguire, a Phil Jones, some of these players that receive critiques on a national level. And in reality, the industry, in terms of how players are supposed to receive it and what is right, what is fair, and what is too much. Because in reality, there's so many different perspectives. And in the article itself, and firstly, it's a pleasure to be on board with you guys. Now one of you allegedly. But it's the different perspectives because there's a lot more than we see. Because I think at times, if it's about Fernandes or so on, we just think about Bruno Fernandes. But what about like their families? What about their friends? What about people who care about them? Because for Bruno Fernandes, you could say it doesn't matter because he's in control of it. But for all those other people in your orbit, I think there's a real discussion to be had about, like, say, the value of certain critiques. And I don't know if you guys would agree with this to start with, but I think the critiques and stuff that we see, do you believe that like certain critiques carry more weight depending on who's saying it?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, obviously, if Roy Keane is criticising the captain of Man United, it carries a lot of weight because Roy Keane is probably regarded as one of United's top 3 greatest ever captains in terms of what he's won and his influence. So if Roy Keane is criticising the current Man United captain, then that carries a lot of weight. But if myself or Rob was saying it, it'd carry less weight because we don't have the track record of Roy Keane. But I take your point. But I think, you're in the media as well now. So do you feel that you have to temper your criticism sometimes because of what you know goes on in the dressing room in the sense of criticising somebody?
I think that's a good question. And I'll hold my hands up. From my perspective, I'm somebody who had a long career, good career. But there's so many times where, say, if you criticize somebody who's perceived to have done more than you in their career, then you immediately dismiss your opinion. That's one side. But then the other side, I don't like to say anything that I wouldn't say to the person themselves. I think there's a standard within football where the players who are playing are very good at football. And I think sometimes some people are quick to draw the line between, say, whether somebody's out of form, whether somebody's no good. And I think when I mentioned the Roy Keane factor there, like, firstly, for anyone who's lived through it, like, Rob, how do you think Roy Keane would have dealt with criticism on this scale from if he was playing in this era now? Like, would he be, okay, yeah, no problem, I'm going to try and impress whoever? Or do you think he'd be a bit more on the front foot?
But I think that is, and that is part of the problem, isn't it? That you often hear Man United players, Man United managers in particular, talking about how tough it is to deal with the criticism of former players because they're all talking from a point where they won everything in their career. So there's nothing that you can necessarily... What can Bruno Fernandes bite back at Roy Keane? Roy Keane is, you mentioned there in your column, that he's probably the most successful captain in Man United's history. Now, Bruno Fernandes is doing the job in the best way that he possibly can. He's trying to be a leader in the way that he knows how. But he can't bite back in the way to Roy Keane because Roy Keane essentially is talking down to him is the wrong word, but talking down to him in terms of career. Whereas who could have done that to Roy Keane when he was captain of Man United? No, Brian Robson was a wonderful captain at Man United, but didn't win half the things. Wasn't as half as successful as Roy Keane was at Man United. So immediately, for someone like Bruno Fernandes, I feel that you're on the back foot. And actually, I've got to say at this point, I think that Bruno Fernandes has handled this all wonderfully because he's been asked about it in a mix zone after one of the games. He's also been asked about it, you mentioned in your column, live on TV. I think it'd be very, very easy for players like Bruno to want to bite back and make it a bigger issue than it perhaps is. But I think he's handled it really, really well to the point where a lot of fans now are looking at it and thinking, well, actually, we don't want to go against Roy Keane because of what he did for the football club, but I actually don't think he's got this right. I don't think he's got that criticism right.
I think Bruno Fernandes actually has really grown as a player and as a person in the last 6 months. But I think, like you say, Rob, his reaction to the criticism from Roy Keane has been to go out and do it on the pitch even more than he has been doing. So he's really stepped up. And I think, I think we've all been critical of Bruno Fernandes in the past, and me definitely. But I think this season he has really stepped up, and he has been the one player at Man United that has carried the flag this season. But just on that, Nedum, Bruno has kind of reacted in a positive sense. Mental strength, character, defiance. I suppose what your point is that if a player is getting criticised and it's affecting his family or himself or herself, then they could go the other way and retreat to their shell and lose their form. So the players can handle it in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. And to be the captain of Manchester United is one of the most significant captaincies in world football. The amount of scrutiny that they face, not least of all because for the size of the club, the relative lack of success over the last 10, 15 years means the criticism is very, very stark. It's very strong at times. And for other people, it is tough because the example that I gave within the column is, say, when you're going to a stadium to play in your games, you can take friends and family with you. And all of a sudden, when they're in the stands, the stuff that they're hearing, they can't argue with everyone. People know, the people that know you know what you're about, know about your intent. This is managers, this is teammates, this is friends, this is family. But it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody that's watching you is educated in that same way. And this goes, again, to not necessarily push back against Roy Keane, because Roy Keane has always been opinionated. He's got a very strong stance. He knows what he believes in. He'll praise things that he likes. He'll really dismiss things that he doesn't. But in reality, does he know what Bruno Fernandes is doing as a captain for the football club? Probably not. Does his version of what a captain should do vary compared to what other people are doing at this moment? Probably. But because Roy Keane has said it, I think the audience then says that they can think it and they can be it themselves. And that's what I'm sort of reluctant to sort of buy into. And I think as well for you guys, especially if you, Mark, there, you mentioned Bruno Fernandes, he's received a ton of critique across the last few years, but you can change your opinion of it because you're seeing it for what it is. I think a lot of former professionals, they don't.
Well,
I think they stick by it.
As a player, I'm trying to think of many examples when you were playing because you might have some, but if a certain player continues to criticise, and Roy Keane does it a lot, does it become a kind of a parody? Look, he had a great career, but you're thinking, God, he's off again, What?
Yeah.
The players that actually dish out praise as well as criticism are the ones you take more attention of because they are prepared to go both ways.
I don't know. I think with Roy Keane, we keep mentioning him, and there are a few other people. The thing that draws the biggest audience sometimes, in my opinion, in Premier League TV is the Man United Inquisition after they lost a game of football. Because all of a sudden, the key figures will now start complaining about the key people they think are responsible for the downfall of the football club in any particular game or any particular moment. And in reality, this is just Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5 of saying the same thing. But there's a lot more nuance and stuff that comes into it. But I don't think it ends up being a parody because the team, relatively speaking, is not being that successful. And I think, as I say, the critique that some people can get, especially on that national TV level, because of that seat on TV, especially in the UK, is massive because it's one of the few times where a football community comes together to watch something in unison. So what is said then carries the most weight because the active audience is there. And so many things come from that. There are times when there'll be a game on Saturday morning, and then come Monday afternoon, we're analysing what Roy Keane has said about this team. That's the discussion for the rest of the week. And, it is what it is. And when some people are naturally we have our biases as such, we all do. But I think, again, the critique that, as a player, the critique I would receive from former players is one which used to frustrate me the most because that's the one that allows people to think they can say and to do whatever they want outside of that field. But it's the one that should be the most educated because they know the difficulty of doing the job that's going on right in front of them. So that's what disappoints me the most, I believe.
Nedum, can I just ask, you mentioned there about the impact that it has on friends and family, and I think you talk in your column a little bit about your experiences at QPR. My eyes were open to this actually on a Champions League trip, a United Champions League trip to Atlanta, where I think it was under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer and Harry Maguire was going through a really, really tough time. The social media backlash towards some of his performances. United weren't performing very well, so everyone was on them. Fans, pundits, everyone was on them. And Harry Maguire's family were in a restaurant in Bergamo just ahead of this Champions League trip, and there were fans in there. And obviously, the conversation turns to Harry Maguire, and he gets quite heated. It gets to the point where Harry Maguire's family have to leave this restaurant because they just can't be there anymore. They're having an argument with fans that it's not a safe environment to be in. They have to leave. To me, that is far, far too much. And you talk about, your experiences at QPR. What is it like to be in that situation, and what is the impact on friends and family when ultimately they're just coming to watch you play a game of football?
Yeah, at times I do look back and feel sorry for friends and family who will come into a difficult situation, whether that's for you as an individual or for the club as a collective. Because there were times at my time at QPR where, like, I'd say to my wife, like, don't come, don't bring the kids. You know, I'd spend the first part of my career saying, oh, let's go, it's football, it's Saturday, Sunday, let's go and do this. Because it's a great job. You know, for me, it's the best profession I could possibly have envisioned being a part of. But all of a sudden, you know the sentiment, you hear the noises in the stands. But for them, they're having to hear it. So much like anger being directed towards like a collective or individuals. And when it's unjust, like it hits you deeper. And for those like friends and family, they want to stick up for you. They want to fight for you, but they can't because they're going against everybody. And when you're in that position, like with Harry Maguire not being able to just be in a his family not being able to just be in a restaurant, it goes too far. And I want to say, go on record, with the piece, I'm not saying players cannot be criticised because of course they can be. They deserve to be for things which are going against the standards which they'd set at previous times. But it's very easy for things to just topple to a point where it's too far. And for when it becomes too far, it only stops after somebody has to come forward and say how much they're suffering. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're so sorry. You know, we didn't mean to do this, didn't mean to do that, as was the case with Phil Jones. But it takes a lot, again, for a player to come out and say that they're struggling because within this whole macho world of like pro sports where everybody's watching you, if you perceive to be weak in any particular way, you know, before you know it, like people just say that's who you are.
Can you separate the criticism from former players from criticism from supporters and criticism on? Is it all the same or is it different?
No, it's different. I think it's different because some of the stuff that, like, say on the if I go to a game and I listen to stuff on the terraces, some of the stuff that's said, like, I know it's just not the case. You know, it's a long way from being the case. And the influence and stuff that most people have is relative to the people who are in their orbit. So it might be people in their section within the stadium or something. It might be like in a forum somewhere. And back in the days, you know, that's what it was. But it's more so like, say, for example, back in the day, in the early 2000s when I first started playing, like the local journalist was huge. You know, playing for City, the MEN was dictating a lot about who they believe was to be good, to be bad. Forums talking about all this. But if something was going the wrong way, before you know it, someone might just be banned from the training ground. You know, think about the power that Sir Alex Ferguson could have. Okay, this guy said this, so they're not coming in anymore. These days, you could ban all the like written media. Well, how about social media? How about the TV people? How about this? There's an element where access is at a greater level now. So the critiques and discussions can come from any angle you want. And for some, they'll say, you know, yeah, just don't pay attention to it. Most people do not pay attention to it. And in fact, I'll give you another example. So I was the under-21s captain for a game against France, and we were playing, it was like around this time of the year, it's March time, before going to the European Championships in the summer 2009. And we'd qualified, France hadn't qualified, so they sent a bit of a younger team out to play against us. And we got battered in this game, yeah. It was like really humbling, weird, battered, yeah. And as captain, I've got to go and do the press afterwards. And as I went into the conference, a guy said to me, so Frank Lampard recently has come out and said that young players get too much too soon. What do you make of that? And like, I was like, what? It's like, what's just happened there? Because I thought I was going to be facing questions about this particular game. You know, on that 21 side for France, that's a very talented side. Like, we didn't play to our best, but it's a talented side. So now that thing which I knew nothing about has been hand-delivered to me in the rawest of moments where I'm thinking about the game that's just happened. And the response I gave was like a fair one. Like, you know, I don't necessarily believe that to be the case, blah, blah, blah. The next day I'm having a war of words with Frank Lampard somehow. Someone who I never would have had that with because it's someone that like is one of the icons of English football. So again,
they should have said those nasty things about it, should they?
Yeah, of course. So you could literally have no idea what's going on, but someone will deliver it to you because they want a response. And when it's time for that response, like all of a sudden you start thinking about, well, what should I say? What can I say? What can I do? And your job is affected from that point.
That is the issue right now because I know one paper and probably two that basically employ someone on a Sunday night to sit and watch the TV to basically use the Roy Keane quotes, the Jamie Carragher quotes, or whoever to turn it into a back page. And from this point on, after every Super Sunday, check what the back page is the next day. It will be Keane blasts X player or Carragher blasts X. They'll be using the quotes because they're because managers and coaches have now become and players have become so much more careful about what they say. it's unusual that you can get one of those. I mean, me and Rob have been to plenty of press conferences, and you come out thinking, God, there's nothing there. It's all very tactical. So Roy Keane will drop a bomb or say something, and that will create the headline, which will create the Bruno Fernandes storm, which will create the issue which you've addressed and you've spoken about. I just want to ask you one thing, though. I mean, you've been doing the punditry now for what, 2, 3, 4 years? Is there any player that you've since regretted criticising, or anything you said that should have said that?
Criticizing.
It could be constructive, just because you've said it.
No, the most passion I felt when doing punditry actually came when United lost 3-0 to Newcastle 2 seasons ago. Carabao Cup. Yeah, just because, like, from a professional standpoint, like from a like a human standpoint, like, I don't support United at all, like, not even close. But I was standing there in that game. I was watching the game that day, and I was looking at them as professionals, and I thought, this is a disgrace. And something within me was kicking in to where, like, this is how I'd feel if I was playing for this team right now. Like, I'm looking for a reaction from these guys and they're not doing it. And on that particular day, I was very, very tough, I think, on Dalot, because he looked like he just gave up in certain moments. Because that game itself, it's not a trap game. Newcastle fielded an 11, just about, because they had about 10 players injured at the time. They wanted the game out of the way. So for them to be winning, I think 3-0 or whatever it was at Old Trafford, I was looking at the individuals within that team and I was really frustrated. And I think that came across more so than any other time when I've been doing analysis, because overall I can be quite calm as I describe it, but I was actually, like, angry as I was talking. And from there, a few people have mentioned it to me about me saying this and saying that and doing this and doing that. And I don't necessarily regret it, but I think maybe there were points at which I would have missed because I was so emotional about what I'd seen in that moment. So that's the only regret that I have, because I need to be able to take a step back and really look at what's happened, as opposed to being in there as if I've just played, because obviously I hadn't.
It's because you're watching the game with me. That's why you were angry.
Oh, God, yeah. Of Mark Ogden flipping Old Trafford watching football. I mean, it's going to send you over the edge, isn't it?
How much do players read and see, do you think? Do you think it's... Because often managers say, I don't think he reads it. I don't think the players read it and see it. But do players see more than we think, or do they see less than we think? Do they really can they shut themselves off from it?
I think certain players can shut themselves off from it, but I think it comes with getting older. Like, if you are young, like, social media is your home, the same way it's for every other person at that same sort of age. So, like, I say, like, a 22, 23-year-old not being on Instagram would be really weird, for example. And the things that they like on Instagram, like, if you love football, you're probably following football pages on Instagram. You're not just, like, following fishing channels and stuff like this. Like, you are part of that football community. You're getting the jokes off and all this stuff. You're trying to enjoy your life. Maybe you're seeing some skills you like, or you're tracking another league. So when all of a sudden, like, that then seeps into other bits, like, you're not searching for it, but you could become it. Like, if you're playing in a big game, see, we're talking about the 1%ers now, but if they're playing in a big game and something bad happens to them in that big game, like, they'll be talked about on all of those big platforms. And we're talking about millions of people seeing it, and now they're engaging and they know your handle. So it's at such and such a person, and they're letting you know what they think about it and so on. So they will see it. And worst case scenario, really, like, their peers and their friends and so on. Like, even if the player doesn't see it, those are the people who are seeing it. Go on.
Going back from when I was younger doing this job, and you got training grounds to be allowed in, and it would be, you'd be pulled up, or your journalistic colleagues would be pulled up by a player, basically hitting it on the shoulder of the paper saying, what have you been writing? But now I imagine that it's no longer newspapers. I bet it's minimal newspapers. It's more about, like you say, it's Instagram, it's Twitter, or TikTok. It's not the players sitting in the restaurant at the training and looking at the papers. That's old school. But I do remember a couple of times. There's one occasion, I won't name his name, but a player, it was he'd made his England debut, and he wasn't very good, and somebody had written that this player had actually earned 2 England caps, his first and his last. And he read this in the paper, and I actually witnessed this player with it was like a cartoon sketch with a rolled up piece of paper, basically banging the journalist on his shoulder with his papers to say, what are you saying this for? First game and second game, or two. But that shows that the influence papers have. But I think now it's totally different.
And to be fair, you say it's totally different, but I think it depends on the audience, because some people still consume things in that manner. Some people are still going to maybe look online to see what, like, a journalist is saying, or maybe someone's going to go and see what, like, Fabrizio Romano's saying about whatever, like, as a younger person. But I think it's very easy to enter the cycle to where, like, we talk about players as if they're just like characters within, like, some TV show, so it's not real, so you can say what you want. And the moment that becomes the case is when you realize at the end of the day, when you do see these people, you see how it affects them and those people in their orbit.
The old chief Man United writer of the MEN tells a story about being at a game at Blackburn or somewhere and driving back down the motorway and pulling alongside the Man United team coach and seeing David Beckham on the window, banging on the windows and doing this through the window to say, you better give me 10 out of 10 in the play ratings in the paper tomorrow morning. And this reporter was looking at him thinking, why do you care about your play rating in the Manchester Evening News? But he did care. He cared because it was important.
It's human
all
nature.
Talk about it in the dressing room and he wanted 10 out of 10.
Well, hopefully there's going to be more columns to come, Nedum, that are going to be as interesting as this one. And we'll be back on talking about it in the next few weeks.